New documents reviewed by reporters Lee Fang and Jack Paulson over at The Guardian indicate that Israel has relaunched and funded a sprawling propaganda campaign meant to control political discourse and criticism here in the United States toward Israel. Now, Israel used to call this program Kela Shlomo, but is now known as Voices of Israel. It includes 80 different programs that are meant to be done in concert. So concert is usually something that is used to refer to this propaganda campaign. The campaign is mainly targeted at the United States and Europe. And in the past, Voices has spearheaded efforts to pass American laws penalizing Americans who take part in the BDS movement or other non-violent means of protesting Israel's occupation of Palestinians. From October through May, Israel has spent about $8.6 million on this effort to, quote, reframe the public debate in favor of Israel. And as Eli Clifton, a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft put it, apologies, quote, there's a fixation on policing American discourse on the US-Israel relationship, even college campus discourse from Israel, going all the way up to Prime Minister Netanyahu. One struggles to find a parallel in terms of a foreign country's influence over American political debate. Now, there are various groups that have worked with this effort, including something known as the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism. And luckily, here to discuss this story with us is one of the reporters who broke it, Lee Fang, independent journalist. Please subscribe to him over at Substack. Lee, thank you for joining us.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. So let's actually start off with the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism. You know, a bulk of your reporting on the story focused on them and what they've managed to accomplish. So tell us more about this organization and what they've managed to do.
Well, this is a think tank based in New York. It was originally housed by Yale University, but it was ousted by Yale in 2011 because it lacked academic rigor that many administrators and other academics noted that it was more focused on pro-Israel activism rather than producing genuine scholarly reports. But this is a group that has been very close to the Israeli government. There are documents that were obtained by Israeli journalists back in 2020 that showed that as much as 80% of their budget came from the strategic ministry of the Israeli government. And they've coordinated with this shell company tied to that former ministry known as Concert or Kela Shlomo. Now it's known as Voices of Israel. It's gone through several rebrands. But this think tank produces reports. It lobbies members of Congress. It produced a report last year and lobbied members of Congress, many of whom referenced this report during that infamous December hearing with Claudine Gay and other university presidents when House Republican lawmakers were claiming that because of the influence of Qatar and other Persian Gulf countries, that was the reason that there was allegedly rising anti-Semitism or hate on elite college campuses. Later in April of this year, ISGAP, their leadership took credit for that infamous hearing, claiming that they had played a big role in terms of ousting Claudine Gay from Harvard University. They've gone on to meet with congressional leaders, calling for increased investigations of universities, of pro-Palestinian activist groups on college campuses. And last year, Sima Vaknin-Gil, this is the former chief military censor of the Israeli government, of the Israeli military, pardon me, someone who has worked in Israeli intelligence her entire career. She became managing director of ISGAP. And as our story goes through, the leadership of ISGAP has continued to report on their continued activities to the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, all throughout this entire process. So, our story combines government documents, some that are just seeing the light of day right now, but also just these public hearings. Just as the United States has public hearings about what our military is doing, what our intelligence community is doing at times, the Israeli government has some open hearings where they have broadcast their strategy in terms of shaping US discourse and US public policy. And we use that in our piece.
Thanks for watching. Our audience has helped build TYT into the media giant it is today. Together, we can accomplish anything. Support our work and join us at tyt.com/team.
Lee, I want to come back to the false charges of anti-Semitism, which are meant to disguise shutting down critique of Israel in America. First, I want to talk about think tanks in general. The mainstream media uses think tanks for so-called scholarly opinion nonstop. I mean, this is a concept that goes back all the way to Lewis Powell writing his infamous Powell memo in 1971, where he says we should create fake think tanks where we tell people in Washington how to think, but it's actually in favor of corporations, right? And so now corporations have used that, and now foreign countries are using that. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, et cetera, have also funded think tanks. So I think there's an argument to be made that no one in media should ever trust any think tank. Let alone quote them as if they know what the hell they're talking about, let alone one that is funded by a foreign nation. What do you think about that in general?
Well, I think in general, we need better disclosure. Oftentimes, this is the great trick that any special interest group uses. You mentioned foreign governments, of course, any domestic interest, big pharma, big oil, you name it, any interest group that is seeking favor from public opinion, from public policy. A preferred strategy is to conceal their lobbying interests through an institute or a foundation that has an academic appearance. And so, a think tank, a 501c3 or C4 that doesn't disclose its donors is the preferred vehicle. So yes, I've done dozens of stories on the think tank industry, as it were, revealing the donors, revealing the strategies. But no matter how much it's scrutinized and disclosed through the press, this is something that the media falls for over and over again.
Yeah, you're right about that. I mean, they literally cite think tanks as if they're authoritative, credible sources that should be trusted without any bias or conflict of interest. And when it comes to the organization we were just talking about, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism, you also focus on how 80% of its funding as of 2018 came from the Israeli government. They're putting together reports, which they then go lobby to members of Congress with. Members of Congress like Elise Stefanik take the report and they use it to carry out these hearings of university professors. And it all appears, right, to the public as if this was an effort that started with members of Congress who really wanted to get to the bottom of anti-Semitism on college campuses. In reality, this is the effort of a foreign government meant to shut down any criticism of the Israeli government. Am I understanding that correctly, or am I getting something wrong here?
That's part of it, and this ties to a lobbying campaign that's going on in Congress and in state capitals and other legislatures all throughout the U.S. and all throughout the West right now. That ISGAP and other groups in the kind of orbit of the Israeli government are promoting, and that is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. They have a definition of anti-Semitism that includes harsh criticism of the Israeli government. And what's happening right now is that all of these organizations, or at least many of these organizations, are pressing lawmakers to enact new bills, new legislation that conflate and encode the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism into US law, meaning that if you engage in certain harsh forms of criticism of Israel, you are getting a hate crime sentencing enhancement, potentially more prison time, or what was passed in the House of Representatives last month, that the Department of Education can view certain forms of criticism of Israel as a civil rights violation, and then funding can be revoked from universities, or there could be official civil rights investigations. You can criticize any government in the world. You can criticize our government, and the First Amendment protects you. But they're hoping to shepherd this through and make an exemption for Israel.
It's crazy.
So an Israeli exception to the First Amendment for the United States. Yeah, that's going to play really well. I bet that doesn't drive hatred towards Israel at all. I mean, what a great idea. Jerry Nadler, who's a bit of a legendary Jewish American politician, said, "Don't do this. This is a bad idea." And so there's at least some sane people in Washington saying, "No, I don't think we should make it illegal to criticize Israel. That is so dumb." So okay, but I want to go to the false charges of anti-Semitism, because I think that is the most effective thing they have all the way up until today, right? Which is, and the reason is that there is real anti-Semitism, so it's easy to find, right? So like if you wanted to find Islamophobia, oh my God, there's mountains and mountains of Islamophobia. And if the Saudi government was like, oh, okay, find 2 or 3 instances or 30 instances, and now let's pretend this is the biggest problem and that no one in America is ever allowed to criticize Saudi Arabia, and if they do it on a college campus, make sure you have them arrested. I would imagine that we would all be massively outraged. Now you've broken the story, that is what Israel did. And it was callous, and it was coordinated to use false charges of anti-Semitism to make sure no one could criticize Israel. And in fact, students, American students, would be arrested for criticizing Israel. So I'm sure that after your report in The Guardian, backed up by reporting in Israeli papers and the New York Times, etc., that's it, right? There's congressional investigations, and this is outrage, and they're gonna let all those, and all the media outlets are apologizing for the smears of all those protesters, etc. Has that happened?
Look, I don't have a crystal ball here, but I've covered foreign influence campaigns for a very long time, looking at foreign influence from Saudi Arabia, from Morocco, from China, from many different countries, from Saudi Arabia. It was my reporting that led to one of the largest civil penalties in Federal Election Commission history on a Chinese billionaire funneling foreign money into our politics. This is something I've covered for a very long time. I've also watched and observed the enforcement of the Foreign Agent Registration Act. This is a law we've had since the 1930s that polices foreign influence and foreign lobbying. We've seen since 2016 an increase in enforcement of this law. Paul Manafort, the former Trump campaign manager, of course, went to prison over his conspiracy to evade the Foreign Agent Registration Act. We're seeing a lot of enforcement of this law, but not against Israel. All the groups mentioned in my piece, if you read my piece, it looks at ISGAP, it looks at another group called Cyberwell, it looks at another organization, the National Black Empowerment Council, others that are previous and current partners to this shell company tied to the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs. There's a very aggressive minister in the Likud government, a close ally to Netanyahu, who's spearheading all of this, who's kind of the strategist behind a lot of these measures. We've documented the money, much of the money at least. We don't have the full picture of what's happening, but we've shown it in the piece. We showed the kind of intent. Many of these groups going to Israel, or at least appearing on Zoom and saying that yes, we're working with these ministries. Yes, we're documenting these students. We're passing this legislation. We're doing these activities, but so far, no clear sign that there's going to be any far enforcement.
You mentioned Cyberwell, and I want to go to an excerpt from your piece because this raised alarm bells for me, especially given what the state of media is, given the fact that a lot of journalists are now kind of striking out on their own and they're doing independent work, which requires them to rely on some of these social media platforms to either market themselves or even carry their content. So you write, another group, Cyberwell, a pro-Israel anti-disinformation group led by former Israeli military intelligence and Voices officials, has established itself as an official trusted partner to TikTok and Meta, helping both social platforms screen and edit content. A recent Cyberwell report called for Meta to suppress the popular slogan "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And so I was wondering if you could elaborate on that portion of your reporting a little more. Does that mean that these companies literally have representatives from these groups that are tied to the Israeli government working to censor content creators or people who post on these platforms?
Well, look, I'll tell you what I do know. I was one of the Twitter Files reporters. I went to Twitter HQ in December 2022 and had an exclusive look at a lot of those files. I reported a series of my own stories about the influence of the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, in shaping a lot of the content moderation policies. But another story that I think received a little bit less attention that overlaps a little bit with this is that Twitter, like many of the other social media platforms, invited NGOs to help. For any of these social media companies, they're dealing with billions of pieces of content. They can either do it algorithmically, which has its own problems, or invite these outside groups, including these NGOs, to help them moderate content, to screen and delete and flag certain forms of content. And perhaps for a business reason or a liability reason, what have you, they have a long pattern and practice of inviting NGOs, many of whom have their own political agenda, have their own interests. So, I reported on certain NGOs that were funded by the pharmaceutical industry that were helping Twitter moderate and delete and censor content during the pandemic. I've reported on many other defense contractors and other government-funded NGOs that have done similarly, and I've provided documentation showing how these NGOs have shaped the content that we can read on Instagram, on TikTok, and on Twitter, X now. Cyberwell is just another example of this. This is a group led by the officials from Israeli intelligence agencies and from this kind of strategic organization concert that's the focus of my piece, that are, again, presenting and discussing this with Israeli lawmakers and putting it out in their own reports saying, look, we're shaping the coverage that people can read. We're shaping the content moderation policies relating to the Gaza war, relating to the ways that people criticize Israel. And of course, again, there is hate, there is anti-Semitism on these social platforms, but time and time again, we're seeing benign and regular criticism of the Israeli government, or criticism of the Israeli military's conduct during the war being conflated with anti-Semitism and used as a justification for removing content.
Yeah, there's two different problems there, and I noticed on TikTok that, and I know a thing or two about algorithms, that if you put hashtag Israel, hashtag Gaza, hashtag Free Palestine, anything along those lines, that video is going to get no views. So I get around the system by not using any of those hashtags. So, but it's obvious TikTok is suppressing the content, and now that you have seen your reporting, it's not complicated why. The Israeli government is telling them to suppress the content, and they're obeying. So this is madness, total, utter madness. And Lee, just quick question on this, then I want to go to the bigger question. Have you seen, like we talk about in the think tank context, the Saudis do it, Qatar does it, all corporations do it. This is not just Israel, right? In the context of the social media outlets though, do you see Meta and TikTok and others going, oh yes, please, Muslim governments come and regulate our platform, and if anything is slightly anti-Muslim, just take it off?
I have not seen that, but historically these issues are a little bit murky because we don't have the full picture. I did a story showing last year and going off some older information that Saudi Arabia had actually planted their intelligence officials and bribed officials at Twitter, but they weren't going after the American domestic debate. They were looking for anonymous Saudi Twitter accounts who are criticizing the Saudi leadership, and they were hoping to unmask these Twitter accounts so they could arrest these people domestically in Saudi Arabia. So many governments are involved in social media. It's a big focus in terms of how do you control information, how do you control a population, how do you shape public policy. But I haven't seen any evidence so far, and of course anything is possible, of any Middle Eastern or Arab government influencing or shaping the Gaza war content debate in a way that Cyberwell or some of these other organizations that I mentioned in the piece.
Yeah, because some countries are considered more legitimate in America than other countries. So if Israel says, I'm going to regulate your platform, apparently the platforms go, of course, sir, right away, sir. Take out anti-Semitism, which is some of it is real and some of it is totally made up, just so you shut up about Israel and its war crimes. So that leads to the major question. Look, we talked about it in the context of the companies who manufacture doubt. Oil companies, cigarette companies obviously invented this. So did you see in your reporting any documents from these propaganda outlets in Israel, funded by Israel, that says, hey guys, don't do fake charges of anti-Semitism, because like there's real anti-Semites out there like Nick Fuentes and arguably Candace Owens, certainly Kanye West, etc. And save your ammo for that, because this, we want to combat anti-Semitism, but don't do it about Israel critics that are not anti-Semitic. Or was it, do it about all of them so they shut up about Israel, because the whole point of this is to protect Israel.
No, for this piece, I took over 2 months working on this piece. I listened to so many different Knesset hearings that had them translated and looked at strategy documents from the Israeli government. Let me just share one anecdote. Well, before I can share that anecdote, let me just say, no, since October 7th, this has been very focused on saying any critic of the Israeli government, of the Israeli military, of the Israeli policies in terms of the Palestinians is motivated by anti-Semitism. I think there was one witness that I saw during one hearing who said that, it's not helpful for us because, they were having American activists come and basically testify and talk about strategy. One person who was affiliated with the US coming and saying, it's not helpful for the pro-Israel cause that so many ministers and lawmakers in the Israeli government keep saying there are no innocent Palestinians, kill them all, or let's turn Gaza into a parking lot. That doesn't help us. Please stop saying that. That was one exception. Another exception that I think it was very interesting in looking at these documents and hearings. There was a left-leaning Israeli NGO, B'Tselem, which, full disclosure, I've met with, and when I've traveled to Israel, Palestine, they've taken me on a tour of the occupied territories. But B'Tselem came and testified at one of these Knesset hearings and said, look, there are reports of Israeli citizens traveling abroad, and when they try to book into hotels and just engage as tourists, people will see that they're Jewish or that they're Israeli, and they're canceling their bookings. That's something that our government needs to focus on, not just censoring or pushing back on critics of the government. And the ministers just ignored them and said, no. What we need to focus on is college campuses in the US, passing these laws in the US, promoting the war.
Wow.
They just kind of dismissed this one critic who actually brought up a very interesting form of anti-Semitism.
So don't address actual anti-Semitism, address fake anti-Semitism for purposes of Israeli propaganda. Amazing.
Focus
and by
on
the way,
war, the information war.
Yeah, and that's why I mentioned manufacturing doubt. Because all you have to do is manufacture, well, is it a genocide or is it not a genocide? Oh, you're an anti-Semite for saying it. So now I've made everybody nervous. Am I going to be smeared? Am I going to lose my job? Is there going to be negative consequences? Now all of a sudden I have doubt as to whether I should say things that are true. Not hateful, but true, right?
Yeah,
and that's the whole point.
It's meant to sow fear and intimidation. And what you just brought up, Lee, about how Israelis traveling abroad or getting their bookings canceled, like there was literally a story about that out of Japan today. An Israeli tourist was going to Japan, had a hotel booked. I guess the people running the hotel realized it was an Israeli person. They decided to cancel and literally told this person it's because of Israeli war crimes. You can't be doing that. I mean, this is just a regular person, right?
And that's just such an interesting dynamic because that's clearly, hateful, bigoted, the type of behavior that there are ministries within the Israeli government that are supposed to protect Jews globally, that are supposed to push back against bigotry and any type of collective punishment. Blaming Palestinians globally for the actions of Hamas or blaming Jews globally for the actions of the Israeli government. That's a form of bigotry. But instead of focusing on actual bigotry, on the real concerns around anti-Semitism, these institutes, these foundations, these kind of strategic advocacy groups are zeroed in on controlling discourse around criticism of the Israeli government and the Israeli military.
Yeah, because they're not trying to solve for protecting Jews. They're trying to solve for protecting the right-wing government of Israel. And that is a very, very different mission than actually protecting against anti-Semitism. And I want everybody to understand, look, we explained corporations do it and other countries also do this. But yes, in America, Israel does have more power. Is it because the quote unquote Jews have more powerful or run the world or any of that nonsense? No. You see Jewish Americans standing up against this all the time. But does AIPAC have disproportionate power as the NRA does, as Big Pharma does, etc.? Obviously. Yeah. Denying that is denying reality. And by the way, also part of this plot. No, AIPAC spending $100 million doesn't affect anyone. In fact, if you say that, you're an anti-Semite, because our job is to confuse you about what anti-Semitism is so that you protect Israeli war crimes.
Lee, thank you so much for being generous with your time, and thank you for your excellent reporting at The Intercept. Now you're independent, and I just want to encourage everyone in our audience to follow you and subscribe on your Substack. Thank you again, and I hope you'll come back soon.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.